What's up everybody, back with another dungeon guide, and today we're taking a look at the new Mega Dungeon Tazavesh, the Veiled Market. I'll be going over all the bosses, their main mechanics, and how to defeat them. And there's a lot to cover, so let's hop into it. Starting with how to unlock it, which is very simple. You'll be able to pick up a new quest at the Innkeeper in Oasis that starts a small quest line that you need to do in order to unlock the new Mega Dungeon, and it takes about 15 minutes all in all. Now there are a grand total of 8 bosses in Tazavesh, all with their own quirky themes that go hand in hand with the Veiled Market, as well as what part of the instance you find them in, ranging from fighting the Postmaster bot, playing in a band, and even a pirate dragon. The Mega Dungeon itself is split up in 3 parts. One is the Veiled Market with 6 bosses in it, another part you get ported to Stormheim for 1 boss and Borealis for another one. So at the start of the dungeon, you'll be outside of the Veiled Market, and after defeating the first boss, Zo'phex, you'll gain entry to the actual market itself, where you can kinda pick and choose your route and which of the next 3 bosses you want to kill and in what order. Now, upon defeating 5 bosses, you'll be able to go to Stormheim, then Borealis, and finally back to the top of the Veiled Market for the final boss. So with that said, let's check out the bosses a bit. So for the very first boss, you'll be facing off against Zo'phex the Sentinel. Pretty straightforward fight. Zo'phex will occasionally detach his arms that begin to swirl around the room, dealing damage to players hit, and upon regrowing or replenishing his limbs, he will deal 25% more physical damage until he again throws away his weapons. Now in the same theme, the boss will sometimes confiscate a player's weapons, silencing and pacifying them until they retrieve it. Once a player has retrieved their weapon, they gain 25% haste for 6 seconds, so all you patters want to hold cooldowns and pray they get their weapons stolen. Don't do that. Also, keep in mind he can throw the stolen weapon into one of the swirls on the ground, which is less than awesome. He will also put up a rotary body armor every now and then that slowly moves around him. If this barrier is between him and a player, it will absorb all damage done. And finally, he will cast Interrogation, fixates a player, detaining them in a containment cell, and slowly moves towards the contained player. While advancing towards his victim, he will deal a large amount of arcane damage to anyone in front of him. Destroy the containment cell to stop this and free the player. And upon doing so, a security measure is triggered, which is just a big group-wide AoE. Keep in mind though, as the tooltip says, it deals damage to anyone in front of him until the cell is nuked down, so don't be in melee and in front of the boss during this. Once you're finished with this boss, take note of the boss room. There are multiple arches or portals around the walls, and you can unlock portals throughout the dungeon that connects to this room. So if you happen to wipe, you don't have to run all the way back. So on to the next boss and the menagerie. 3-phase fight. Each phase is 1 mini-boss, if you will. You start off fighting one of them, and when one boss reaches 40% HP, a 30-second timer starts before the next one spawns. So if your DPS is on the low side, you might have overlaps where you fight 2 bosses for a short duration. First one you face is Alcrox, a mini-hungering devourer, if you will. Cast Gluttony on a random target that lasts for 21 seconds, which allows you to safely nom volatile anima in a later stage of the fight. The player with Gluttony will also deal ticking damage to other players within 5 yards, and when Gluttony expires, it will jump to the nearest player, so it will be present for the entire fight, but just 1 Gluttony at a time. Every now and then, Alcrox will cast Grip of Hunger, pulling all players to his location, and then after a few seconds do a 20-yard AoE around him. Stand in it, and you take a ton of damage. Lastly, there's the Grand Consumption. Waves of orbs fall down towards the encounter space and explode after 4 seconds in a 12-yard AoE, leeching a ton of health from players hit by it. They seem to drop in 2 sets, so if there's a lack of space, simply stand in the most recent swirl, then move into the oldest one after it's detonated. 30 seconds after Alcrox reaches 40%, Acolyte joins the fight. Acolyte will use Venting Protocol, releasing volatile anima orbs, and deals damage to all players within 7 yards of him. Now these anima orbs that he spawns, if a player gets hit, they deal a large amount of damage and decreases their damage done by 5% for 1 minute, and this stacks. However, the player with Gluttony from Alcrox can nom these up without taking damage and instead get 5% increased damage. And these are really important that players with Gluttony do nom up, both to free up space as well as getting that big DPS increase. And these never despawn unless you nom them up, so nom 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 nom. Acolyte will also use Flagellation Protocol, gets an absorb, can't be interrupted while the absorb persists, and starts pummeling away at its target, the tank, dealing a ton of damage every 0.5 seconds for 5 seconds, so nuke down the absorb and interrupt the boss. Lastly, there's Purification Protocol, afflicts 2 players with unstable anima, deals ticking damage every second for 7 seconds, and upon expiration, afflicted players explode in a 25-yard AoE, and this was dispellable if you want to offset it. Otherwise, just get away from the rest of the party. 30 seconds after Acolyte reaches 40%, Venza Goldfuse joins the fight. And once you've defeated Acolyte, its corpse will continue to spawn out volatile anima orbs in a rapid succession. Now, Goldfuse will use Whirling Annihilation, whirls madly with the edge of Annihilation, drawing all players towards her and deal a very large amount of damage every second to players within 7 yards of her. She will also cast Chains of Domination on a random player, chaining them in place, decreasing their speed by 100% until the chains are destroyed, and you can shapeshift and such to get out of it. And that's pretty much this fight, so on to the next one, which is the Mailroom Mayhem encounter, where you fight the P.O.S.T master. First ability is the hazardous liquids. Purple circles spawn across the floor that you need to soak. If you miss a soak, a pool of spilled liquids spawn that deals damage and reduces movement speed if you stand in them. And when you do soak a circle, you also get a stacking dot that lasts for 10 seconds. Now, sometimes the poor old postmaster will go haywire and start firing off fan mail in every direction, which deals a large amount of physical damage to players every second for 5 seconds. And this is a just heal floor head, it is unavoidable. So don't do what I did and backpedal away a bit because you're like, ooh, it's a whirlwind. On top of this, there's the money order, drops a ton of gold on a player. Lethal damage split between players hit by it. 6-yard AoE, so have at least 3 players splitting this, ideally all players. Just stack it under the boss. Lastly, there's the big mechanic, which is the unstable goods. Releases packages of unstable goods that explode if not delivered within 30 seconds. Around the encounter room, there's a couple of mail chutes or post portals, whatever you want to call them. One of them will activate and players needs to run over a package to pick it up, then throw said package into the active post portal. Throw it in the wrong place or failure to deliver it within 30 seconds results in a boom. Every player takes a large amount of damage and a dot that lasts for 6 seconds, and it hurts a lot. And these packages can spawn in the hazardous liquids on the ground if you're unlucky. On the flip side, keep in mind that you have 30 seconds, so if you have enough DPS, you can just nuke through it and ignore the mechanic completely. TLDR, split the money order damage, soak hazardous liquid circles, and deliver the boom boom packages into the correct portals. Next boss, or boss-ish, is the Aumisa's Oasis. Battle of the Bands! Before we go over this fight, let's go over how to deal with the minigame to unlock this boss. Outside the entrance to the Oasis will be a vendor where you can buy 1 item. A player then needs to pick this item up, preferably the tank, and deliver it to one of the vendors around the market. Which vendor depends on the item you get, and the vendor will have a title corresponding to your item. So for example, you get a jade or some kind of gem, go to the gemstone vendor. Get a cloth, go to the tailor, etc, etc. There's also weakauras, of course, to automate this if you don't want to do it yourself. Now, while you're doing this, you will get attacked by guards that fixates on the player carrying the goods, which is why having a tank doing it makes it a tad safer, but other classes might do it faster, so there's your trade-off. Do this a couple of times so you get a password so you can enter the Oasis and pretend to be a band. So for the boss, everyone pick an instrument and jam away. Which instrument you pick doesn't matter a whole lot. Some say tank on horn and healer on drums makes it a bit easier. Some say tank on guitar, etc. But when it's not on hard mode, it doesn't matter all that much. Name of the game though is Hit the Notes. Each instrument will have its own extra action button ability that either propels you forward or shoots something, and you either need to propel yourself through notes on the ground or hit notes with whatever your instrument shoots. Like the drum kit, for example. Sadly, Thankfully, the drummer doesn't get to power slide an entire drum kit across the floor. Missed opportunity, Blizzard? Hitting notes will also give you a stacking buff for each note you've hit that grants you 1% haste per stack. Then when you've collected enough notes, you instead get a huge damage increase. After you've collected enough notes, phase 2 starts, where a bunch of mobs spawn that you need to defeat in order to go back to phase 1 once again. Disruptive Patron spams Hyperlight Bolt, which is interruptible. Unruly Patrons throw rotten food on the ground indicated by green swirls, and they also throw drinks at random players, which is just unavoidable damage. And the Oasis Security smacks tanks with the Security Slam and has an interruptible menacing shout that deals group-wide damage and interrupts spellcasting for 6 seconds, so make sure you interrupt it. Simply tank him up, AoE him down, and avoid the swirlies on the ground. And if possible, try and maintain the jazzy buff by hitting the notes that can spawn. Once defeated, phase 1 starts again, and the third time you get into phase 2, Zogron will join in as well, which is the main boss, I guess, but more of a mini-boss really. Needs to be tanked, of course, periodically pulls everyone into him and applies suppression spark to everyone in the party, and they get a 5-yard circle around them, and if you stand in someone else's circle, you take damage from both your circle and theirs. And he can use crowd control, where he puts up a shield in front of him that deflects all incoming attacks, and when this expires, he deals lethal damage to anyone in front of him. So yeah, spread with the suppression spark, be behind him during crowd control. And on to the next one, which is Zo'asmi. And this is a weird one. When you pull the boss, 3 sets of markers or relocators will spawn that move across the encounter space. 2 triangles, 2 squares, 2 circles. Step into one of them and you get teleported to the matching marked relocator. So move into square, get ported to the other square. Throughout the fight, the boss will divide the room, first at 70%, then at 40%, and first one is half the room and then into 4. And the room is divided by a barrier that you cannot move through or target through, so effectively just a wall, if you will. You can, however, blink through it with any blink-like ability. But other than that, the only way to get across is to use the marked relocators that moves around. And this ties into the rest of the mechanics. First one is Shuri, or however you pronounce that. Boss creates an expanding ring. If you get hit by the expanding ring, you get a dot that deals a ton of ticking damage for 10 seconds. Goal here is to simply use the relocators to teleport into the ring so you don't get hit by the ring itself as it expands. And as the room gets divided, you may need to hop into multiple relocators to get where it's safe. So the Shuri might spawn under the square relocator, but you have to jump into triangle to get to the square one so you can teleport to safety. Boss will also use a double technique. He jumps to a random location and starts his double technique, which is a 15-sec cast that needs to be interrupted twice. And the kicker is, no pun intended, the timer doesn't reset between interrupts. So whatever time you had left on the cast when you interrupt the first time, that's the amount of time you have left to do the second one. And boss usually teleports away to an other side of a barrier after the first interrupt. And if you fail to interrupt it, you pretty much wipe. Everyone takes a ton of damage and gets a really nasty dot. Now this one is really only very tricky once the room is split into 4, as you might have to use several relocators to reach where the boss actually is. But you have quite a lot of time to do the interrupts, and if you have anyone in the party with blinks, they're a great thing to have for the last interrupt, so you always know you'll hit that one wherever he is. Boss will also use Quick Blade, dashes through a player, causing players in his path to take some dam, and it applies a bleed, so avoid being stacked. Moving on! Upon defeating Zo'asmi, you can now port to Stormheim, where you get to fight swarms of Murlocs before making your way to the next boss, Hylbrande. Pro tip: do not overpull Murlocs. The scaled binders drop fish stick totems. You heard me. Now these fish sticks heals every mob around a metric ton, so having multiple scale binders is less than optimal. So Hylbrande, or Hylbrande, as us Scandinavians would say, is again a very funky boss fight. You either fight the boss and some adds, or deal with some consoles around the room in an intermission phase. So for Hylbrande, himself uses shearing swings, which smacks everyone in front of him twice, dealing a large amount of physical damage with each swing to anyone in front of him, so only tanks in front of boss please. And the boss follows the tank during this, so avoid spinning around if you can. Titanic Crash, cone-like smash that deals a chunk of damage and stuns players hit for 4 seconds. don't be in it. Purged by Fire targets a random player, and it's pretty much a big circle that chases that player. Stand in the laser and you take a ton of damage every 0.5 second. I mean a ton of damage. And it also leaves behind a purging field, which is fire on the ground. Don't stand in it. The beam moves rather fast, so focus on running away and dropping patches pretty much anywhere except in the middle of the room and in front of a console. Boss will also spawn 2 Purifier adds throughout the fight, and these adds needs to be tanked and killed. They will channel energy into the boss, reducing his damage taken by 25%, so make sure to interrupt that. Also blast random targets, dealing a ton of damage, and in the intermission they will block interaction with the security panel, which will make sense in a bit. So do make sure to interrupt Empower defense so boss doesn't take reduced damage, and focus on killing these adds so you don't have him up during the intermission. They don't have to die super fast just before the intermission. Now, when the intermission starts, Hylbrande will stand in the middle of the room, become immune to damage and channel Sanitizing Cycle, which slowly fills the room with fire. And if you're too slow with dealing it, well, you die. 4 orbs or bypass codes will spawn that players can pick up, and you need to get these into the correct security panel or console. And these consoles are the ones that the adds can block interaction with if you have adds up during this. Now, to make this more fun, you don't know which security panel to put any of these in unless a player interacts with the main Titan console. Doing so will reveal to that player only which security panel to put each bypass code in. Have fun, pugs! Hopefully you can't just weakaura this, but those people are smart, so probably will be a weakaura for this eventually. Either way, easiest way seems to be just marking each console with a random mark, and the player that clicks the Titan console just announces which goes where. Red on green, blue on yellow, yellow on red, etc, etc. Totally not confusing. And yeah, that's pretty much the fight. Dodge stuff, get laser beam out, slap and interrupt adds, deal with the console in the intermission. And on we go to Borealis. Andy should have been a mount boss. Timecap'n Hooktail. First of all, don't be in the water, it's Borealis after all. There be sharks. So, for this fight you'll be swarmed by tons and tons of pirates or corsair brutes while you're fighting the dragon. These adds cannot be tanked and will fixate and chase random non-tank players. They can however be CC'd, gripped, knocked, pulled, you name it. Hooktail's ship in the background will also bombard the encounter space with big red swirls. Don't stand in them. It will also fire an anchor shot directly at a random player, dealing a bit of damage and stuns them, and also drags them towards the ship and possibly into the shark-infested waters. Hooktail itself will also use Hook Swipe, which is a tail swipe that deals a large amount of damage to players and pirates alike. Players can also get hooked by this. And Infinite Breath deals a large amount of arcane damage in a cone in front of the boss to players and corsair adds alike. Also stuns you for 3 seconds and knocks you back. Any ad hit by this pretty much melts, or well, they insta-die. And lastly, there's Double Time. Calls upon her infinite magic to drastically increase the movement and attack speed of the pirates in the area. So pretty much what you want to do is always hit adds with the breath to the best of your ability, which can be easier said than done. We found that having players kite these adds into the breath and move out in the last second helped a lot, and you can use things like grips, knockbacks to get them into the breath. Vortex will be great for this as well. Now keep in mind that the boss starts casting the breath and follows the tank with it, then after a few seconds locks its location, then fires it off. So the tank can spin around as much as they like while aiming the breath, then move out of it to avoid getting hit yourself, which makes it a lot easier to aim. And yeah, just try to always hit an ad and to kite adds in front of boss when possible. Other than that, it's just a standard don't stand in fire, don't be behind or in front of a dragon. And with that, we move on to the final boss of Tazavesh, Solia. 2-phase fight. During phase 1, she will spawn 2 adds, or assassins rather, that you need to tank and interrupt their shuriken blitz. Other than that, stack them up and pad. She'll also cast Hyperlight Spark, which bounces between players, not unlike the Hyperlight Spark from Xymox and Nathra. It's the same. And on pull, as well as every minute following, she will cast Collapsing Star, which spawns a large sphere somewhere in the area which lasts for 25 seconds or until 4 charges has been removed from it. You remove a charge by moving into the sphere, and doing Doing so triggers a group-wide dot that deals a ton of damage over 3 seconds and this stacks. Meaning if you bounce into it really fast, you're going to die really fast. And if it expires by timing out, after 25 seconds it will trigger any remaining charges, so you can't just ignore it either. Easiest way to deal with it, assign your tank or a DPS to be on star duty and just run into it. Wait 3 seconds, then run in again. And of course keep an eye on the party so you don't trigger it if someone is super low. Otherwise just bump into it roughly every 5 or 6 seconds or so and you'll be fine. You have 25 seconds to do it 4 times. Now when the boss reaches 40% you get a little RP, boss goes a little bit bananas and heals to full health and phase 2 starts. And now you get to smack the boss when she's in her somewhat elemental form and she will no longer spawn assassins. Now the 5 relics you might have seen floating around above the boss during phase 1 will now have moved down to the encounter area. And as soon as phase 2 starts and periodically after, she will cast Power Overwhelming and Hyper Light Jolt. Power Overwhelming reduces the damage she takes by 99%, and Hyper Light Jolt targets everyone in the group and gives each player a red line with an arrow, which indicates which way this jolt will go. After a few seconds, it fires off and travels through each player in the order indicated by the arrows, and the name of the game, hit all 5 relics with a jolt to make them go away, at which point the boss will again take damage. If you fail to hit 1 or more relics, you will simply cast Hyper Light Jolt again, but this time it will deal 50% increased damage, which stacks until you die or finish off the relics. Easiest way to deal with this is to have everyone move to an orb and make sure their arrow will travel through it. Doesn't matter what orb, just each player get behind an orb or relic and you'll be fine. That's it. But like I said, missing one isn't the end of the world, but it's fairly easy to avoid missing one. Keep in mind that things like anti-magic shell immunes or abilities that drop your threat like feign death will cause the jolt to not bounce from that player, so don't do that. On top of this, you will cast Energy Fragmentation, which is by far the best looking ability ever in this game, which is pretty much a chain reaction between the relics. Hits one relic that then cascades out energy in all directions before jumping to the next relic, doing the same, etc, etc, until it's bounced between all 5 relics. And I mean, just look at it! Following this, you usually cast a relocate, which just moves the position of the relics, and after a relocate, there's always a Hyper Light Nova, which is a 14-yard eruption around each relic as well as the boss. Be in either one of them and you take a ton of damage. She usually overlaps Collapsing Star during this as well, so be mindful of when you trigger the Collapsing Star so you don't get screwed by the Novas. And with that said, if you have any questions about this dungeon or its bosses, hit me up in the comments or become a patron. As a patron, you get access to the Stankie Discord where you can get help with anything raiding related. I also stream all of our progression raids on Mondays and Tuesdays, so don't forget to check that out. Also, don't forget the usual stuff like, comment, subscribe, it really helps me out. Thanks for watching and I will see you next time.